Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Merlin the Muddy. Today, we're going to be talking about the Spider Man movies. I recently watched all of the Spider Man movies again. If you refer back to, there was a little random podcast I did with my wife before we moved into our new place a couple months back, and we had just got done watching all the original Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire Spider Man movies. And I kind of wanted her to watch No Way Home, and I kind of explained that you sort of need to watch them all. Combine that with the fact that we had watched Into the Spider Verse again not that long ago. I've just, of course, as a lot of you might know, and if you're new to the channel, you might not know, I'm a pretty big Spider-Man fan. So, of course, I had to make sure I wanted to watch all these again, and you don't really have to twist my arm to do that. But I decided that for the first time ever, I never really have done this, oddly enough, is I'm going to try to rank these movies. As I said, I'm a big Spider Man fan, and there is no Spider Man movie that I really dislike. And I actually feel like I sort of had that thought before I watched the movies again this year in 2023. But no, upon realizing that, no, I do not hate any of these movies. I don't really dislike any of them. I think that every Spider-Man movie made is kind of good. I definitely think there are some that might be more flawed or problematic, and I could certainly see why some don't work quite as well narratively, or why you might have personal tastes. But I'm such a big Spider-Man fan, and all of these movies do at least a couple things well enough that I can bypass that or excuse it. So take that into account. These aren't. I kind of was looking at these almost as like kind of sort of ranking as quality, mostly as standalone Spider-Man movies. So I don't know if I would say that these are necessarily quality-wise the best, but I felt like they held up the most for me upon rewatching. So what the heck, something to talk about. And of course, naturally, I'm sure that there'll be someone that disagrees, and I try my hardest not to be controversial, but this might be one of the rare times where that happens. But regardless, I am happy to hear your thoughts. And if you are new here, please don't forget to subscribe. And of course, comment below your thoughts about this. If you agree, disagree, start a conversation. That's what my channel is always about. And if you like the video, certainly like it to boost those analytics and whatnot so that the algorithm helps me and my channel can continue to grow because I think that's awesome. Got a pretty good community here, I think, for the most part. We're nice people on Merlin the Mighty, I think. Anyway, enough procrastinating. My ranking for the bottom one here is Far From Home. And Far From Home was one of the ones I watched most recently. And as I said, I liked it. I think it's one of the ones that's still pretty good. But having only watched it like, I think just yesterday, I'm already kind of forgetting some things about it. It's one of those ones that definitely was more fun to see in the theater. I think the strongest thing about the movie is the humor. You know, I really love how they have interjected uh, Spider-Man Peter's kind of friendship with Ned. I think he's a great addition to the MCU Spider-Man movies. Really, these days it's kind of the only stuff from MCU I'm kind of interested in vaguely is the next Spider-Man movie because of these. I think Tom Holland does a good job with the role, and I think that the other thing I really did enjoy is Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio. I always liked Mysterio. It's kind of one of my favorite classic Spider-Man villains. He's got such a unique design, and I kind of like to play on because this one they make it seem like he's from another dimension and he might be almost like a Doctor Strange type. But we know he's once again a disgruntled Tony Stark employee, which I think is kind of funny. He and the Vulture are kind of byproducts of Iron Man, which thematically, with Spider-Man sort of taking the reins almost as his replacement, Iron Man was kind of created based upon seeing his own demons, the result of his weapons dealings, and kind of creating his own villains in a way. And that's kind of carrying over into what Peter's dealing with. So I think thematically that's an interesting carryover from the original Iron Man movie. Special effects are pretty good. I think that Tom Holland and Zendaya have great chemistry here. The negatives about the movie, because I was watching all these with Amanda, with Ula Dax, and she kind of gives me some other perspectives too, which is sometimes good to hear. And I think that the one of the reasons I put this one so low is because I really like the Spider-Man movies because I've always thought they could be fairly self-contained, and I'm not saying that a movie, part of a bigger franchise, necessarily has to be self-contained, but Generally, I do think it is good and the mark of a great film if you can enjoy it as a sequel or part of a standalone part of a greater universe, but also as it works and functions well as a standalone movie. I think it typically has to have that. Maybe not always, but I think a lot of the great trilogies, Lord of the Rings, Back to the Future, the Star Wars films, they all function pretty well as regular movies in their own right. And watching Far From Home again, I realized that it really feels like there are things we almost miss, and I have to probably watch the Thanos films again, but I don't remember them like establishing him and Zendaya's relationship too much in those movies because there was so much else going on. I know that, and of course he gets the new suit, but if you have missed this movie, we we were almost kind of like it does feel like we're missing a piece here because the way the MCU is set up, especially in the later phases, they become so interconnected that if you don't watch several, if you miss a movie or two and you miss some of the shows, you might miss a little detail, and sometimes it's an Easter egg and sometimes it's kind of a bigger plot point, and it doesn't detract too much from the movie that we don't know where his suit comes from. And you could argue that that's kind of the brilliance of the MCU model, since they kind of started doing that with Iron Man and everything way back then, is kind of making it a continuous thing where you see they're all interconnected and you want to see the next movie. And you could argue that was also modeling the best and worst aspects of a lot of comic book crossovers, as it encourages you to watch the other films or read the other issues, which is, of course, classic marketing for that. But that also creates the problem of if you have too many of them, you get too bogged down. Some people might not want to watch the Thor movie to find out what's going on with Hulk or with Iron Man or Captain America or whatever the specific example is, if you have people that care about one character. So wasn't a major detraction, but it was a little bit to some degree. And I also thought it was kind of funny. I liked Mysterio in this movie. I thought they did a good job with his visuals and some of the more psychedelic, weird illusions that he comes up with, which is classic for Mysterio. And I like that they kind of course, tied that into the drones and trying to make it more techy because this is the way that the MCU has been much more focused on trying to keep things contemporary with the technology, but tie it back into Iron Man stuff. So I like the fact that they did that, and but it just kind of felt like Mysterio was. I do think he was a decent villain, and he was played well, but kind of underutilized. And I was also pretty confident he was bad because I almost wanted them to go more for that he was from an alternate universe because that would have been more interesting. But then again, it kind of feels a bit like they just said, you know what, most people, I guess a lot of people might not know Mysterio is a bad guy, but if you are, I think even a casual Spider-Man fan, he's bad. So, I don't know if there's a way they could have fixed that, but I just feel like they could have explored his motivations a little more because they were interesting, but he basically was just, I guess they said he was unhinged and sort of jealous of Stark's power and the spotlight, kind of, but I felt like his motivation was a little muddled by the end. I did like that fact they doubled down at the end with, oh, we're going to not only reveal Spider-Man's secret identity, we're also going to frame him for murder. So usually in a comic book, big massive event, you do one of those things, and for this they did two, which is funny that they kind of deal with it a little bit in the next movie, but then of course they do something that erases it. So I feel like that could have had more potential. It was a really good ending, but they don't really explore it as much as I think they could have. But anyway, that was Far From Home. Once again, pretty good movie. Cool visuals, cool humor, some good character stuff there. But I just feel like there are things that are a little bit underdone, and it's a little too reliant, I think, on the bigger MCU to stand fully on its own. Just noticeably there. The next one's kind of a big thing for me because for a long time I am kind of a defender of this movie, and I'm a fan of it still. But I will admit, after watching it after all these years, I did not think it held up quite as well. I could see more flaws with it, and that is The Amazing Spider-Man. And I'll say right here, it has nothing really to do with Andrew Garfield as an actor. I actually think he's pretty good, and I still think his portrayal as kind of a little more of an everyman rather than kind of your stereotypical nerdy guy. I think he sold a little bit more of the accessible teenage perspective. I think that more people could kind of just see, all right, he's, once again, I think he looks a bit older than a high school student, we were saying, much like Toby did, but he didn't seem completely boxed into just one stereotype, and I thought he was pretty decent. I think his Spider-Man was pretty good, although I think they were definitely going for the darker, edgier, definitely separating themselves a little bit more from Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, just trying to be kind of multi-layered and trying to dive a little bit into the thriller stuff, sort of like the spy caper corporate espionage thing, with all the mad scientist stuff. But they have the mystery teased a little bit, which is closer to Spider-Man's parents' origins, which in the comics they were spies and they were killed by the Red Skull and framed, and he had to clear their name. Whereas here it's kind of like they were killed by mysterious people and it's connected to Oscorp. So I like that they tied it in a little bit with that, but of course made it their own thing. No, I think the movie is pretty good. I think we were kind of saying that it seems almost a little bit like the characters, like he and Emma Stone, have a lot of good chemistry. I think that Gwen Stacy is pretty good in this movie. They make her quite smart. They make her a strong character, but very dynamic. I think that the romance is good, but it also feels a little rushed and maybe a little unrealistic once again. Like, people don't talk like this, and being around high school students more again, most of them just don't talk like this or act this way. And it just feels like they have a more nuanced, layered, mature kind of relationship that just seems like it would work better if they were in college or a little older, which is, I'm sure these actors were probably in their mid 20s or something, at least by this point. So it feels more like that. And you're like, we're saying he's in high school because we have to market that he's in high school because that's what people want from Spider-Man, but it's kind of distracting. And that's a common issue with a lot of these movies, is when they just cast high school students that are much older. And with Tom Holland, that was a little better, but yeah, it's a bit annoying there. And I think, I mean, honestly, one reason I liked it is because they decided to go darker and grittier, and it did feel more in tone with the comics that I kind of read when I was a teenager. Because, you had like I think it's Michael Stranzaki, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but the whole, kind of the early 2000s, up to like the late 2000s, honestly. I feel like that's kind of when I last was really keeping up with Spider-Man comics, and just it was kind of along the same time of the Ultimate storyline, when it was very techy, a lot of that corporate espionage, darker storylines, more conspiracies. It felt more in line with that, with comics from the 2000s and the Ultimate series, and I really appreciated that. However, I do feel like it's a little choppy. It feels like they're doing some things really well. Like, I love the visual of Spider-Man looking for the lizard by creating the web and then having the vibrations to sense where it is. Like, that's a cool visual, and there's a lot of cool shots. There's some good stunt work there. There's also some cheesiness, though, some of the lines, of course, and the whole crane operator thing. But I like that they tied it in, because he saved his son. That moment where he saved the kid was pretty good, even though a little cheesy. Kind of gets you right in the heartstrings there. So I think that it works pretty well. I also, of course, like the lizard, but watching all these back to back, see another, of course, mad scientist trying to turn himself into a lizard, turn everybody into lizards. It's kind of silly, and it also is just kind of in line with a lot of other things we've seen before. And I like the lizard, and it's unfortunate because I feel like he was a little underutilized. Once again, they could have dove deeper, and I guess it was just enough because the motivation for the lizard doesn't necessarily have to be the most complex. But I feel like they could have done more with it. They did more with the villains in the Sam Raimi movies, so I feel like the lizard could have gotten a little more. I also kind of wish that the animation budget was there to kind of keep his white lab coat on more, to have him more in daylight. I mean, I'm glad they had that fight in the school, because every other time you see the lizard in this movie or later, he's always in darkness because, I guess to hide the CGI, it's expensive to make him look good. But I also, even though they did keep with the original design of him having more of a humanoid face without the snout, I kind of wish at some point he had grown the snout, because I think that would look better. I don't know. I guess in an expensive movie, you can't dedicate a whole character to being CGI, but I also know that there have been films that have done that. So I just feel like he was a little underutilized there. But it's like I said, the movie feels a little choppy with stuff like that. Like, some things are kind of silly, some things are kind of dark, and it's like they have this big conspiracy, but it once again just feels like it feels a little bit like it's trying too hard sometimes to be cool, to be edgy. And I don't know if it really feels like one fluid uniform thing, which might be different than another group of films I'll talk about later. Good timing, transition wise. Then we're going to go into Amazing Spider-Man 2. And I think originally, upon watching this, I liked the first one more. And I think that the second movie continues the expanding on the strengths and issues of the first one, certainly. And it feels like they kind of build a little bit more into what happened with Peter's parents and trying to dive more into what's going on to Oscorp. And they were clearly just going to kind of hint at a Sinister Six thing, which I kind of wish that had happened, which it sort of does later, but I kind of wish we had gotten Amazing Spider Man 3 purely for that, because I feel like this franchise was actually going somewhere, and it had sort of like an okay beginning. Like Amazing Spider Man's fine for the most part. It does enough to distinguish itself from the Sam Raimi movies, but they kind of rebooted it pretty early, as we all know, and it feels a bit like they kind of just did a lot of the same things over again. It feels very much like the first Tobey movie, in a lot of ways. It covers the same beats. But with Spider-Man 2, it feels like they try to do something different by kind of having multiple villains and tying it into what's going on with Peter. And there are a lot of things about the movie that I think that, yes, it kind of is still trying to be dark and edgy, but it's a little more committed to that, and it's trying to build up to it. Um, uh, Amanda was actually saying that she felt like the payoff for the conspiracy wasn't really that much. Like, oh yeah, it's Peter's dad's DNA was interjected with the serum for the experiment, and it worked with his DNA, which is why he's Spider-Man, which is cool. But she felt like there needed to be more, and I guess the other part of it was, oh, they're building more super soldier stuff, and or ways to augment people. They're just creating bad guys basically, or planning to do evil weapons dealing. Once again, still not really 100%, but that's basically what it is. Oscorp is evil. Big surprise. But I feel like there's some moving parts there. There's some good stuff once again with, Peter being the guilted guy again, haunted by his promise to Captain Stacy, which he immediately reneges on, and then is still guilty about. So it's kind of like, you could say there are some things about not Toby, Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. Spider-Man is usually flawed and he's relatable, but it almost seems like he's kind of making mistakes that are pushing him into being almost unlikable. Like, really, man, why are you doing that? And that's kind of how he was in this movie and the last, which is maybe why some people didn't like him. Is he comes off kind of like a jerk. Not that Toby didn't, but he it's the way he's portrayed. He's a bit hard edged, and he just makes some kind of really selfish decisions sometimes. So you're like, really, man? So I can understand why some people were really detracting from Andrew Garfield more in retrospect. I still like him, but I get it, and I get why it doesn't work quite as well for some people, and I actually didn't like quite as much, I admit. But the reason why I put the second one up more is because like I said, it sort of seems like it's kind of finding its own identity more and committing more to what it's doing, and there's more moving parts, which makes it more interesting. I do think that they probably could have been expanded on a little more, but once again, we kind of know some of these things already. The high point of the movie, though, I think is really Electro. Like, Jamie Foxx's Electro is pretty cool. They have some great visuals with him. They have a creepy, kind of sad angle to his character, his kind of obsession with Spider-Man, which I think is good. Electro's always kind of been portrayed as sort of pathetic and dull, but he gets all this power, and it really goes to his head, and he gets kind of scary. And just seeing the visuals of him becoming electricity and moving through the wires and the system of the power grid and everything, and how he's kind of basically teamed up with Harry Osborn, who, even though he's kind of just sort of thrown into the movie, and it's like, okay, they knew each other when they were kids. It's like the connection's a little. They must have been pretty close when they were kids, because it feels a little bit, once again, undercooked. But Dane DeHaan, I think, does a good job of portraying a sickly, kind of creepy Harry Osborn. He does a good performance, and I think it works in the movie. And I also kind of like their take on the Green Goblin, where, the serum, to cure him, of course, has side effects that just sort of makes him really creepy, and it gives him the discolored skin and the fangs and stuff, and his hair's sticking all up, and he's also kind of in the armor, which is sort of helping him too. I like that. He's deformed. He just looks really evil and menacing, and maybe some people think he looks kind of crappy, honestly, but I kind of liked it because he just looks like more humanoid, and honestly, it's closer to, I think, a Green Goblin-esque looking villain than we ever had before. I mean, once again, it would be nice to actually see a mask that could work, because I know they make them. Like you go to you look at, like, I guess, a rubber mask at some Halloween store and say, okay, I mean, I'm sure it might be difficult, but Once again, I'm going to go to Lord of the Rings again. Look at the orc makeup. Look at the orc, prosthetics or whatever they did there. Like, just make something that looks kind of like that. We've seen goblins before. Like, make something that looks like a goblin. But I guess it's been tough to pull off with all the stunts and everything. And I don't know if it's up with pyrotechnics or heat or whatever issues. Maybe to make it work with the mouth moving. I'm sure it might be tough, but I don't know. The Green Goblin's never really been perfect on film. But I like the fact that the actual transformation is kind of almost like the Ultimate Spider-Man, where it really almost creates the gremlin-looking guy with his fangs. I don't know. I think he looks good, and I think they do a pretty good job of executing the death of Gwen Stacy, if you'll forgive the pun. I think that works pretty well. The Rhino is kind of silly. The Rhino's silly anyway, but yeah. Yeah, Rhino's silly. I'll go there. But yeah, I like the Amazing Spider-Man 2 a little more than the first one because I just think it has more going on to separate it from the original movies that came before it, whereas the first one just kind of redid some things. Feeling more surprises from people that know me. The next one I actually have on here is Homecoming, which I will say Homecoming has one of the best things about any Spider-Man movie in it, or any film-going movie theater experience specifically for me. Like, there are probably just like a handful of the best movie theater experiences or very memorable moments, and Homecoming has it for me because basically there's I'll try not to spoil it, but the reveal that a certain character might be related to another character, and the door opens up, and in the just in the theater, that collective gasp of just feels like just about everybody in the theater at the same moment had that realization and the fear. Oh no! And it was so well hid because it wasn't telegraphed, and they must have kept the secret of it pretty good online because nobody that I was seeing it with knew, and it's not connected to any version of the comics, so it worked as a good twist. Upon rewatch, it didn't have the same impact, I will say, because I think I had only seen the movie maybe the one time, and with the Tom Holland ones, it was only the one time in theaters. So seeing it at home years later does change it a bit. I think Homecoming works very well as a standalone Spider-Man movie, more than Far From Home does. Still kind of put it a little bit lower because it is tied into the Iron Man movies, which, if you don't know, and the Avengers, if you don't know exactly what happened there, and you could say, oh, if you've been watching it for a while, you should know. Sure, but I'm thinking 10, 20, 30 years down the line, someone puts this movie on, what are they talking about? And I guess if you're familiar with the comics, you can just buy it. Oh, something happened. But, you're kind of like, what? So, okay, disgruntled employees, well, in this case, contractors, because of Tony taking it over, which kind of feels, the damage control agency. It just feels a little bit like kind of odd that would happen, and an easy way to create a supervillain that could have been really easily avoided. But yeah, it works pretty well as a good standalone Spider-Man movie. I like the whole thing on the Washington Monument's fun. There's some good humor once again with Ned. I like their play on Flash. Once again, the bullying and the interplay with the high school kids, their dialogue just seems more realistic. There's a lot of pep and fun energy to the movie. Spider-Man's good. With all the tech, it kind of works pretty well. Tom Holland just has great chemistry. You can watch him by himself interacting with the AI, and it's pretty entertaining. It's just a solid, good, fun movie. And the biggest thing about the movie, which I think had it higher ranked for me for a long time, was because, it first of all has my favorite Spider-Man villain, the Vulture. I love the Vulture, and there's a kind of choppy, not so great video from years ago somewhere online of me just kind of sitting on my couch talking about why I like the Vulture. And I need to probably go and do another video with a deep dive on that, because whenever I tell anybody that, I think they might think I'm just trying to be obtuse or just kind of what do you call it, an outlier of some kind. But no, I really do love the Vulture as a villain, and it was really cool to see, ooh, he's going to be in the new Spider-Man movie, and he's an early Spider-Man villain, so it makes sense he'd be in kind of the reboot of the new character, the new version of the character in this film. And he was played by Michael Keaton, who is such a great actor. He was in Birdman, which is a great movie, so it was kind of cool that the guy getting to play a bird-themed supervillain, sort of almost tongue-in-cheek, after kind of doing his interpretation of an actor dealing with the fallout of, being a superhero would do to the Batman-esque character. So it's kind of cool that, Michael Keaton got to play a supervillain, and he got to play the Vulture. It's great. And I think that was great casting. And he did a really good job being kind of threatening, but also sympathetic. I mean, of course, the messaging's a little heavy-handed at points, but I do like him, and you kind of see him as sort of a relatable character in a lot of ways for a lot of people, I bet. And Michael Keaton just does such a good job of, handling that nuance, but also selling the more over-the-top nature of it. But I will say, and this is kind of a little nitpicky, but the Vulture, even though he's in the movie and he's acted well, and it's great that he's there, he he has the Shocker and the Tinker kind of there with him, so it's not fully like he was able to do it himself. Of course, he is running a gang of villains, which is pretty cool. But I still sort of just want to see this older looking man in kind of a more of a bird suit, kind of closer to the original comics, which I know is probably really cheesy looking in general and probably very tough to pull off on film. So of course they made it more of an Iron Man metal suit with the wings, kind of a Falcon spin-off sort of thing. So it fits with the very techie look and feel of the Iron Man-esque films, which is the baseline of the MCU. So I'm fine with it. But I kind of just want something closer to that where, I mean, he just is in the suit and then is attached to the wings. And I felt like they maybe could have done some, I guess obviously having his head against the CGI, I'm fine, would be look very silly. So I'm fine with him being in a helmet, but I kind of felt like maybe the wings should be attached more like the Falcon. I would really wish it was closer to the Falcon's design, but just like a dark green, and I think they could have done something with the youth stealing thing, which I think is kind of fun. I saw a video recently where somebody didn't like that, but I kind of enjoyed it. And I also kind of think, even though Michael Keaton was good and he had the bald look and he was probably like maybe around 60 when it was filmed, I kind of still think they should have gone for a slightly older man, because I always think of, the Vulture being in his 60s or 70s. He's an old man. You got to kind of sell that. And I just think the concept of an old man in the bird suit going toe to toe with Spider-Man consistently and still being a good threat is just kind of awesome and a little hilarious. But he is also like a pretty evil guy, and he's kind of like an evil mad scientist in his own right. So I like on one hand that the Vulture sort of got his due and was in a good, basically reboot of this version of Spider-Man. But I also feel like he's not quite what I wanted in retrospect. So it's like it's good, but it's sort of a nitpick. But that's one reason why I didn't have it as high up. But it works pretty well as an independent film, and it's funny and it's good. Moving on, I really liked No Way Home, and when that one came out, I thought it was amazing. I thought it was great. And I still mostly do. I think it holds up pretty darn well a couple years later. But definitely I'm not just exceedingly, exuberantly, astoundingly, just kind of really, really amazed by the whole thing. I'm not super blown away by it. I just think it's good. It was fun watching it with my wife and kind of seeing her reactions. And I knew that she'd like it because she went in completely blind, completely unaware of what was going on with it, and that was great that she had the surprise, especially since we watched all these other movies and they were fresh in their minds. And I said, you got to watch The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which she didn't quite understand. I'm like, you'll see, which I guess she kind of forgot when we were watching it. Yeah, no, I think No Way Home is very good. I think it's really cool to see all the villains from these different universes together. Unfortunately, I have this feeling, because I kind of noticed it now, and I think it might get worse later. I think it is a very well put together love letter to these previous Spider-Man movies, but once again, it's a little too reliant, I think, on your nostalgia for those movies. And I think if you don't have the attachment, it's not going to work quite as well. I mean, I still think it works well if you like Spider-Man in general, but like if you don't love the Tobey movies or the Andrew Garfield movies, it's not going to have as much impact. And I think it's kind of minor, but I think that is something that might detract more in time. Like initially seeing it blown away the first time, I wasn't as much the second time. I thought it was good, it was fun, but it was a really, really good piece of kind of fan appreciation, for, what do they call that? Fan service, essentially, but fan service done very well, and it really was a love letter. Really, though, the best thing about the movie is that they do have all these characters together, and it does work pretty well as a Spider-Man story with characters from other dimensions, and you sort of get your Sinister Six kind of story anyway that I sort of wanted. Though no Vulture, it would have been nice if he had showed up. But the actors all do a pretty good job of stepping back into those roles, especially Alfred Molina and Willem Dafoe. Like they really, really do a great job, and I think it's pretty cool. I sort of wish that once again they kept Tom, what is it, Thomas Hayden Church, I think it is. He as Sandman. I think it was clearly his voice, but he wasn't able to be on set a lot, so they had him be CGI Sandman, which is fine. But it would have been nice to see him more on screen. And also, I feel like they sort of decided to, I guess, change Elektra's character a little bit. I guess he grew being Power Mad. He wasn't quite as awkward anymore, but they acknowledged it and then just say, he's different now. And the Lizard, once again, he has a few good lines, a few good moments, but the Lizard is kind of underutilized in the movie. Like, I just feel like, no, like, part of me is like, spend a little more money to have him in the apartment too, hanging around. But and they also clearly say he seems much more evil, like blatantly, than anybody else in the movie. Like they have Doc Ock tied up, and everybody else kind of goes along with it. The Lizard doesn't really make a big indication that he's going to go along, but he's like, sure, I'll come along. We'll stay in the van. We're going to leave the Lizard, who seems more bent on making people into lizards. They don't have a scene where he's like, sure, fine, not really. Well, I guess he says, okay, we have the choice to go or die. Not much of a choice, but like, he clearly seems like he's just up to his own stuff, and it's almost like he kind of knows what's going on when he's like, oh, it begins. Like, how do you know? You know, he's going to go off, and I think is he going to go off and do his own thing? And no, he shows up to fight with everybody again. It's just some of the villains and their interconnectedness kind of aren't 100% fleshed out in a way that makes sense. Like Sandman is on their side because he wants to go home, but then he wants to leave when they start fighting, but then he comes back even though he doesn't care about the cure. But then he's fighting with Electro anyway, and there's a point where I feel like he and Electro should fight more, but they don't. So it's like how all the villains come together for the big fight is not completely airtight, but it's fine. It's just like a little sloppy with some of that, but it's okay. It works for it. You're not really thinking about it, but I'm just like, why are they doing that? It's not huge, but there's some minor things. Once again, it's the chemistry of all the Spider-Man working together, and yeah, there is kind of just the nostalgic element to that, but they do a good job, and it's nice, it's heartfelt, it feels like a love letter to the fans of those people, those actors, those films, and it's all done really serviceably, really respectably, and with a lot of heart, and it works well. But really, what really gets it for me though is Willem Dafoe, like him just being the Goblin again, and his fight with Peter, and it's almost like this sort of transcending dimensions. They're always going to be arch enemies, and one thing that I really liked about No Way Home that I was kind of thinking about doing a video a little more on is I love the way it handles the idea of the villains and changing them as sort of way of kind of recorrecting the fact that in superhero movies and Spider-Man movies, like the villains often get killed off, so they won't show up again, which is very different than the comics, which in some ways might be more realistic, but it potentially is kind of a way to sort of redeem the characters and ask some interesting questions about taking those steps. So I really like the way that No Way Home handled it, and I don't know if it's quite as amazing and profound as I initially thought, but I still think it's worth talking about at some point. So if anybody's interested in hearing more about those thoughts, maybe I'll work on a video at some point in the coming months. But the biggest surprise for me is really these next couple movies here, because watching them all again, I was really surprised because I was such a big fan of the Tom Holland MCU movies and the Andrew Garfield movies that watching them all again and being the first ones, once again, you can check out the couch cast that Ula Dax and I talked about all the original Spider-Man movies. But yeah, I mean, the next section here is pretty much all about the Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire movies. And I'm not really going to talk too much about them because I went into a lot of detail with them in that previous little podcast. But yeah, it pretty much just goes up in quality the further back you go for me. Like Spider-Man 3 and really all these movies, they hold up pretty well. And it really surprises me, and it might sound kind of strange because they are kind of cheesier in a way, but they're simpler, they're wholesome, and there's something about all the Sam Raimi movies, they have like a very cohesive feeling to them. Like they're all part of one vision. Tonally, they're all the same. They all feel the same throughout. They all have a very specific direction and tone and style they're going for that isn't really deviated from throughout any of the movies. It feels really uniform. Whereas the Amazing Spider-Man movies feel like they're trying some things, but it doesn't always quite work with what they're trying to do. And with the MCU movies, they're much more uniform as well, but they feel kind of reliant on other movies to some extent, and they also feel a little more like a product in some ways. And whereas I feel like the Spider-Man movies really feel like a vision, and there's an atmosphere to them that is extremely unique. Like nothing else really helps. No, sorry, nothing else really quite matches that. And I mean, I think that might also just be Raimi's kind of sort of over the top style and his innate silliness and some of the really intense camera angles and a lot of the comic book kind of transitional things and just how over the top things are. And the Danny Elfman score really just helps a lot. Just the soundtrack really helps. It's silly, but it's got heart, and it still takes itself seriously where it needs to. Like there are some darker moments, but there's still very, very classic comic book, where you're involved, but it's just on the edge of goofy most of the time. But when it's sincere, it needs to be sincere. But it all feels like the same vision, the same movie. Like you can tell this guy poured a lot of love into it, and that's even Spider-Man 3, which for a long time, I remember in high school that movie came out and people hated on it, and it was obviously its reputation preceded as like one of the most made fun of bad superhero movies, which, having seen plenty of superhero movies, it is by no means the worst. There are many worse movies. Like Spider-Man 3, yes, there are some silly things about it, maybe too many villains, but honestly I think they're handled pretty well. They all work together pretty well. Even Venom, which I know apparently Sam Raimi wasn't that familiar with and didn't originally want in there, they still managed to make Venom work pretty good in a lot of ways. I think visually, yeah, he wasn't quite there. We need the weird tongue thing going on, but he was fine, honestly. I thought that considering there are 3 villains, it all works pretty well. And of course, I think that there's a great kind of conclusion to the second Green Goblin's character. There's the whole drama, him trying to kind of play Toby's Peter Parker and MJ against each other is really good drama. The whole scene with the ring when he's about to lose it is someone he recently got married. Like that always, I remember that was actually an old gasp in the theater moment. And yeah, I get it. All that, basically that meaning behind what Aunt May said and kind of like handing off that ring. Just there's a lot emotionally there for your audience to be invested in. Just that great shot of the ring close up and then it's about to fall and is he going to miss it? He gets it. Seems like it should be silly, but it's of course once again the superhero stuff really interweaving with the personal stuff, and once again not subtle, but it really sells it well. But yeah, and of course Sandman is just so amazing. Like that scene with the super collider when he's reaching for his daughter's picture. I mean that's just, as people have said, it's like a great short film. It's a really good movie. Even like the silly, jazzy emo Spider-Man, it's silly, but once again, it doesn't really deviate that much from the tone of the other movies. Like people said, oh man, this is so bad, it's so silly. Yeah, it's kind of cringy, but it's sort of supposed to be. And but it's not really that much in line with all the other random silly cameos and weird things, like Bruce Campbell stuff in the movie. It's pretty much the same thing. The Dark Spider-Man's still silly, and to be fair, when he's messing with Mary Jane, he does go too far and it's very uncomfortable and you're not supposed to like him. So, is it the best scene ever? Not necessarily, but it's kind of funny, it's memorable, and it's silly like the rest of the movies are, but it's still done well. I mean, and they committed to the part and to the scene, so yeah, it's still the dance number's good. Dig on this, it's hilarious. So it holds up really well. It's funny though, my original feelings about the trilogy still haven't really changed that much. Spider-Man 2 was like the pinnacle for a lot of people, I feel like, for what superhero movie should be. And it's a really good movie. I mean, it's pretty high up on my list, obviously, so it's I think pretty close to your perfect Spider-Man movie, great superhero movie. Yeah, it's up there. It's just a really great film. Nothing really wrong with it. It works really well. It's got the classic, Spider-Man at his low point and then rising up again, classic hero's journey. emulating times that's happened in the comics with this whole crisis thing. You know, there's some really good classic Spider-Man stuff there. Doc Ock's great. I actually watched the, I think, extended director's cut or something a number of years ago. It's like Spider-Man 2.5 or something, where it's mostly just extended fights with Doctor Octopus, and they're pretty good. Like, I think it was really impressive what they were able to pull off, and I still think it holds up really well to this day. I'd say the special effects in Spider-Man 2 and 3 hold up pretty well today. Most of them. Spider-Man 1, and maybe not quite so much, but there's a lot more practical effects in that one, which I appreciate. But Spider-Man 2, as I've said, for some reason, I don't know why, when I was a kid, Spider-Man 2 unfortunately has the bestowed title of being pretty much the first movie that I was hyped to see that I was kind of disappointed by. And I've never really been able to put it into words why that is. Just, I guess it didn't live up to the hype of that amazing trailer with the car going through the window. But it's a very good movie. And I think it's quite awesome. But there's always been one more from this trilogy that I liked more, and that's the original. The original Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire. You know, I saw that in theaters, kind of like with a lot of people, kind of like right in the nestling high point of my Spider-Man fandom. Right, I think I was like 12 years old, 12, 13, and the movie was just, you know, it was just amazing to see Spider-Man on screen and done well. And I was really into, of course, Spider-Man growing up. And I think right around that time I was getting into those trades of the original Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and John Romita comics, which I still got them. I think it's like there's 100 of them I have. And it's really basically just the issues of the first like 100 issues of Spider-Man, but they're all black and white and just put into a trade. But yeah, I read a lot of those. And that was right when I was kind of just like, kind of still getting a lot into Spider-Man, and was so excited about the movie coming out. I must have seen it like 3 or 4 times in theaters. So thank you to my mom for taking me. I loved it. Like I'm telling you, when around that age, I think that I probably don't think I loved Spider-Man more at any point in the future than I did around that time. At least in that unique, you know, young person way. So seeing that at that time was really just kind of really perfect timing, and I still think it holds up really well as a solid origin story. I think it's one of the great superhero movies. It's one of the great origin superhero movies, and it just does everything really well. Once again, a little silly, a little comic booky, but it still feels in line with that classic feeling of early kind of, I don't want to say it feels like how the 60s comics would feel, but I feel like trying to emulate it through Stan Lee's specific lens, it works really well. And, you know, of course, great soundtrack, great acting from people appropriately hammy. Green Goblin's silly Power Rangers costume doesn't really bother me because Willem Dafoe does such a good job. They balance the drama with the humor. There's some great practical effects. The CGI doesn't hold up quite as well at some points, but doesn't really bother me. Like I said, Spider-Man 2, I think it's neck and neck with this one. I mean, if you said you thought it was better, you liked it more, I wouldn't really fight you on it. But for me, Spider-Man 2002 has just been always the best of the trilogy for me. I think it's really solid, and it's hard to beat. And yeah, it's great. I love it. And part of that might be nostalgia, but it still holds up really well after all these years. And kind of leading up to the top here, having watched it again recently as well, though not in the same line of marathoning exactly, but Into the Spider-Verse is currently one of my favorite movies of all time. I mean, I think that as much as I love Spider-Man as a character and in the comics, I wouldn't say that any of his movies have approached my like top 50 films or even top 100. I'm sure that I could think of other movies that beat it. So Into the Spider-Verse really supersedes it and is up there really high for me. And watching it again, it still is. It's so good. And maybe that for me is the fact that it is animated, because for me, I feel like it is kind of awesome to see your superheroes live action. And I think that there is maybe a differing of opinion of this, because there was a friend of mine, Alex, who's been on the channel before. I don't think we ever talked about it, but I think one time, a long time ago, he mentioned that he thought that seeing superheroes live action was kind of the pinnacle, because it's like bringing them into real life, you know, basically. And you can almost feel like the characters are there, which I do get, and I think that might be the draw for the MCU and a lot of live action superhero movies. That's why they make them, so adults can be like, oh, this isn't kids stuff. But for me, I'm a big lover of animation and reading comic books, which are, you know, cartoons, animated. So it's like, I don't really care about that. You know, I think that it's great to see things live action, but a cartoon animated film or series could be just as good or better than a live action one for me. Like, just because it's animated, I don't feel like I lose that element, because obviously you got something like Batman the Animated Series where it's like that's the best Batman. People pretty much agree. Kevin Conroy was fantastic. So there are certain things that obviously at the moment are still limited in live action, and I think that really that certain aspects within any particular medium could supersede any other, basically. So in any case, I think that it felt closer to the comic books, and the fact that it was animated, they had, I remember looking at one of the videos they put online, how they animated the movie. They were trying to literally base it on the color scheme of original comics, like from the 60s, 70s. I think it was like that greenish, pinkish tinge or whatever. So they were literally looking into the physical paper and how of a comic book, what superhero comics were published on, and trying to emulate that. And that's in the DNA of the movie and why they made it the way they did. Specifically speaking to comic books as a medium, superhero comic books as a medium, and translating that into film. And I think that alone, from a technical perspective, is just amazing. So the style of the movie, the level of detail and creativity, and the color scheme of the animation is just fantastic and beautiful. And they also basically gave me a Sinister Six movie, but with different Spider-Man villains, and you had to team up with different Spider-Man, which is funny and poignant, but also has that great message of what it really means to be a hero. And with Miles Morales kind of basically challenging the idea of like, am I Spider-Man? Am I worth holding up this mantle? How do I choose that? How do I determine that? And I think that's a really great message, for him. And it's another big thing for me too, because another reason why the movie works so well for me and is so high ranked is because I was kind of a little bit of a Miles Morales detractor. I mean, not really a vocal one, but when they killed off Ultimate Spider-Man, Ultimate Peter Parker, I really didn't like that, because I loved Ultimate Spider-Man. Ultimate Peter Parker I thought was a great character, and to see him killed off in kind of this unceremonious way, and then replace him with another character in the same line, I can understand why there was a lot of controversy. But it wasn't like the main 616 Spider-Man anyway, which ultimately I do care about more. So it's like, I don't know why I got so mad about it, but I really liked those comics. So I was like, well, I'm not going to read them anymore because this is a different character, which once again speaks to the idea of, okay, if you wear the costume but you're changing the person underneath, do you associate it with that name? Obviously we've had different characters switch the identities in recent years with mixed results. People have different opinions about that, but I'll admit, I was like, well, Miles Morales isn't really Spider-Man to me. He's like a Spider-Man-esque character, Spider-Man spinoff, but he's not what I think of when I think Spider-Man. But for a lot of people, he might be their Spider-Man, and that's fine. Although I think it gets kind of confusing if you have differentiated versions and there's the same name. So I don't know if he should be exactly Spider-Man, but maybe if there is a different name, I'm not sure. Like I said, I'm not 100% up to date on the comics these days, but I'm just saying that I'm not that familiar with Miles Morales, but I don't know exactly why I was drawn to it, but I just think I heard good things. I saw it in the theaters, and I thought it was really great. I was just blown away by it, and it made me really like the Miles character as just being probably the most relatable, believable teenager, and obviously being more diverse from a different background, I think shows that it can be very inclusive, and there is an importance to having that. And for him to be pulled off so well, I think is just great. And I think I didn't really see the twist coming, or maybe I did, but I still thought it was well done with the reveal. And I think his interactions with the other Spider-Man's great. I think Peter B. Parker, the kind of middle-aged, midlife crisis Parker, is pretty great and pretty relatable in a lot of ways. I loved his humor as well. And I liked their version of Doc Ock. And honestly, I thought Kingpin was great because you kind of have like this big enigmatic, ridiculous, world-ending, catastrophic plan, but all based around a really relatable thing. So Kingpin, I felt like, was a great final villain because he was somebody that conceivably the new Spider-Man, who's inexperienced, could be able to take down, but he's still a threat. And I just love that you've got like the mob boss who's driven with all his money to do this, to bring his family back. It's kind of like shows how he can be menacing and threatening as an imposing force, but he's also, you sympathize with him, and I just think that's great writing and great villain. So I loved the Kingpin in this. So I thought their fight at the end with the whole dimensional hopping on the train was pretty great. Great visuals once again. So yeah, Into the Spider-Verse was great, which is kind of, I think, maybe tied a little bit with Across the Spider-Verse, which I saw recently, but I think I'll dive into that in a more specific video. But for now, we'll say that that's kind of floating around up in that area, although it sort of frustrated me, which I'll get into at some point in the near future, hopefully. But anyway, there you have it. That's basically my rankings. Far From Home, Amazing Spider-Man 2, Homecoming, No Way Home, Spider-Man 3, Spider-Man 2, Spider-Man, and Into the Spider-Verse, with Across the Spider-Verse floating around somewhere up there. So yeah, let me know in the comments below what you think of my rankings, if you agree, disagree, something I missed, another point that might be able to get me to maybe reconsider again and move another film up in the rankings. Certainly love to hear your opinions. Once again, I like them all, so I'm not really saying any of them are bad, but these are the ones that work the best for me upon watching them again. All right, everybody, thank you for listening, and as usual, stay magical.